The Arctic, the largest wilderness left on Earth. Tens of thousands of square miles of ice, snow, and freezing fresh air. This is how it looks, clean, sparkling, an image of health and purity. But underneath, it is rotting and decaying. For most of the 20th century, the Arctic has been soaking up a lethal cocktail of toxic waste from the world's industrial centres. Thousands of miles from the nearest factory, parts of the Arctic are now more polluted than many inner cities. The Arctic is an early warning system for the rest of the planet. The poisoned pole will affect us all one day. Few people realise what a vast area the Arctic is. Stretching out from the North Pole to the Arctic Circle, the region is rarely seen on most maps of the world. 8 nations have land in the Arctic, including the world's richest and most powerful. Opinion divides over the desire to exploit the polar region and the need to protect it. At Cape Churchill, the summer thaw and brief daylight gives scientists a chance to investigate the effects of pollution on the Arctic's best-known inhabitant, the polar bear. Ian Stirling, one of the world's leading experts on the ice bears, is here to measure toxic levels in the animals. At this time of year, he knows he'll find plenty along the shores of Hudson Bay. Every autumn, dozens of polar bears gather here waiting for the first sea ice to form. Their white fur makes them easy to spot against the sandy coast and tundra. Target sighted, he loads a tranquilizing dart. The pilot maneuvers so the shot will go straight into the heavy muscle of the bear's shoulder or neck, where the drug will work most quickly. A frightened polar bear can sprint at 30 miles an hour, despite having to shift 2 tons of bulk. So pilot and marksman must concentrate intensely. The first shot is a success and hits the adult of this pair. The pilot quickly swings round so they can dart the cub. The hit must be made within minutes, so that mother and son will fall into tranquilized sleep together. But this cub is a lively target and proves difficult to line up in the rifle sights. Now both bears are darted and will run on for a few minutes before the drug takes effect. It is almost certain that these polar bears are carrying high levels of toxic pollution in their bodies. The species is under threat. This year, fat and milk samples are being taken from hundreds of bears as part of the biggest ever circumpolar study into the contaminated animals. Meanwhile, a backup shot of tranquilizer is prepared for use on the ground. Polar bears can kill humans. A groggy polar bear must be treated with at least as much respect as one that is fully sober. Within 10 minutes, Dr. Stirling and his team are laying out the bear, ready to take a small sample of fat.
What you do is you notice that polar bear skin is black. A lot of people don't know that. That absorbs heat. Heat reflects down through the hair from the sun. So that actually, although the bears themselves look white, their skin is actually really quite dark. You take a little bit of hair away so that it doesn't bind up on the biopsy sampler. And then this is a technique that's used on humans, human medicine quite regularly. the skin is fairly thick. Now once you're in and you're into the fat, you just take a bit of, and you back off like that, and then there's the fat sample. You just reach in, take it out like that. And then once you've taken the specimen itself, of course there's a little cut, so we take an antibiotic and squeeze lots of it into the wound so that there won't be any infection. And that's really about all there is to it.
The main contaminants poisoning these bears are pesticides like DDT and PCBs, chemicals used in electrical transformers. Both are now banned in most developed countries. They're carried to the pole on high-altitude air currents, PCBs leaking from equipment in the industrialised north, and pesticides from the south. Falling snow flushes them into the Arctic Ocean, where a remarkable concentration begins. First, microscopic zooplankton filter them from the seawater, concentrating the chemicals 2 million times. When fish feed on the plankton, the contaminants increase 25 times in the next stage of this biomagnification process. As seals eat the fish, the concentration factor rises to 1 billion. This happens because the chemicals become trapped in fatty tissue rather than passing through their bodies. By the time polar bears digest seal meat, the level of poison in their bodies is 3 billion times greater than in the surrounding seawater. The polar bear fat samples are brought here to the Canadian Wildlife Service laboratories in Ottawa. It was here 10 years ago that scientists first detected high levels of dangerous chemicals in polar bears. First, any remaining skin and fur is removed. Then, each tiny sample of fat is automatically analysed to identify and measure the hundreds of separate pollutants in polar bears from around the world.
We have presently analyzed over 300 polar bear samples. This printout shows different ions that we're looking at for different chemicals. This is a Greenland polar bear. We're doing a lot of different polar bears from other countries. Russia, Greenland, Finland, Alaska, and of course Canada. In this one is a DDT. I can see DDT and DDD. Other ones have, these are your hexachlorocyclohexanes and DDE, which is a product of DDT. And we'll eventually get to the PCBs and the chlordane-related compounds as they come out.
The research team's initial findings show they're definitely dealing with an international problem.
We have studied this distribution and found that all of the polar bears across the Arctic are contaminated. In many cases, the contamination is remarkably constant from area to area, which clearly indicates that the whole polar regions are, for some contaminants at least, more or less at equilibrium, and that they're distributed completely across the whole Arctic.
One of the things that PCBs do in particular is that they have detrimental effects on the reproductive system. In the Baltic Sea, for example, it's been suggested that PCBs are responsible for a 60 to 80% decline in the reproduction of ring seals. Now, we haven't seen any sign of that in polar bears yet, and hopefully we never will. But we're also looking back at these individual families, because these cubs depend on their mother for a large portion of their nutrition. So theoretically, they should have even higher levels of PCBs in them than their mothers. Okay, we're just trying to collect a milk sample here so that we can follow the concentrations of the toxic chemicals all the way through from being stored in the fat of her body to being converted into milk, and then of course being drunk by the cub and converted into into stored PCBs in his fat. And we're not quite sure how much of at what sort of rate the chemicals go through from her to her cub. So we have to take a few milliliters of milk here. People are interested in things like polar bears and penguins in the Antarctic and so on, and because of their concern about these animals compared to some creepy crawly invertebrate or whatever, they do get more interested and more concerned. And I think one of the values of finding and monitoring things like toxic chemicals in polar bears, in fact, is that we can say to people, here's something that you care about, and here's what's happening. And of course it's happening to everything else as well, but we can monitor it through things that people really will take notice of. So that's part of why it's really important to do this.
It's not going to return to the ice in great shape.
No.
All right, you need a straight line.
Not going to wake up for a while either.
There's an international directory of polar bears, and each animal, when caught, is given a reference number. This is usually tattooed on the bear's gum.
X9406.
Okay. This one was first caught in 1988 as a 2-year-old. We caught
Where?
him just south of the Broad River. Then he showed up in the dump in 88 as well. And then we saw him in 90 back just around in here.
We're taking a tooth out here for age determination to check the age of this female, because one of the important things to do is to look at the concentrations of toxic chemicals in relation to the age of the animal. There's some evidence that suggests that older animals have higher levels of contamination by toxic chemicals. That little tooth there is about half the size of a cribbage peg. You can see it has a big lump right on the end. And this is all cementum, and it has the cap on here. And so what we do is we take the bottom part off and count lines in it, just like the annuli in a tree. And then we know how old she is.
Work completed, the team arrange the bear for a safe recovery and inject a shot of penicillin to prevent any infection. An hour later, they wake up, dazed but none the wiser.
Philosophically, I think we have to change our whole attitude toward the environment. I think for so long it's been a case of man against the environment or conquering the environment. I think what we have to do is go back to being part of it. We have to be able to go through things, not changing things, but being part of it, and so that by the time that we leave no more effect on the environment than a set of polar bear tracks across the snow that blows away and disappears with the next storm.
But problems of the polar bears are mirrored in the human population. Sparsely scattered throughout the Arctic are communities of indigenous people, the Inuit. They too are under attack from airborne pollution. Resolute Bay is one of the most northerly inhabited places in the world. The Inuit of Resolute Bay long ago left igloos and a nomadic life for prefabs and wage labour. But hunting is still an essential part of their lifestyle and survival. Ross and Amashi Malik have been out on the frozen sea ice for 2 days in search of seal. Tired and chilled, they must draw upon their reserves of patience and apply sharply tuned senses to make the catch. A tiny breathing hole in the ice tells that a seal may be lurking below. Amashi will wait for hours in complete stillness for the seal to surface, avoiding the slightest sound which would echo beneath the ice and scare away his prey. If his aim is accurate, he knows he'll be able to feed his family for weeks. The skidoo may have replaced the dog sled for the modern Inuit, but their interdependence on the land has not changed for thousands of years. They say they have always lived in harmony with the Arctic environment. But now, their natural food has been poisoned by toxic pollutants. Like the polar bears, the Inuit are eating food that is seriously contaminated. The fat and blubber of this seal will almost inevitably be full of toxic contaminants. Air currents from southern latitudes are responsible for bringing poisons into the food chain. But 2,000 miles away in the capital of Canada, the issue of Arctic pollution has worked its way onto the political agenda.
The evidence that we're collecting seems to point at the organic contaminants, the pesticides, the materials like this, that are probably causing the greatest problem in the environment in the Arctic. It's a worrisome problem because these contaminants accumulate in the food supplies of the Inuit people in the Arctic. The foods like the whales and seals that they rely on for their major protein intake, these carry the highest contaminant burdens. And so you have a situation where people living in the Arctic may be carrying higher body burdens of some of these contaminants than people living here in southern Canada, which is rather ironical because this is where a lot of the pollution itself occurs, but they're getting the residual effects.
Indigenous peoples throughout the Arctic are represented by the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. It too is shocked by current levels of contamination.
We have to depend very heavily on the animals that are around us, and because there's such high levels of contaminants, PCBs and other toxic contaminants that are being found in the animals, it's not only threatening our lifestyle or our way of life, our traditional and cultural practices, but it's threatening our lives because the very food that we eat is being contaminated from other parts of the world. The pollution isn't coming from the Arctic itself, or maybe some of it is, but not very much. We're not the polluters, but the pollution is coming from other sources.
The Inuit children have always thrived on a hunter's diet, living into healthy old age with one of the world's lowest rates of heart disease and cancer. But now this traditional diet is under suspicion. For small Arctic communities like Resolute Bay, the alternative is processed food, transported hundreds of miles at great cost. In community stores, the sale of junk food is increasing as Inuit react to the PCB scare. But no one knows whether it's more unhealthy in the long term to eat poisoned seal blubber or TV dinners. For new mothers in the community, these choices are particularly difficult. Government health studies in villages throughout the Arctic have revealed evidence which has alarmed Inuit parents.
No, not that high.
The studies found dangerously high levels of PCBs in mother's breast milk, where the poisons become concentrated in the soluble fat.
Perfect. Hey, are you hungry? Is that the problem?
Government advice is that breastfeeding is still healthier than bottle, despite the contamination. But this startling news has caused fear and confusion amongst the population.
The fact that high levels of PCB is being found in mother's milk, that in itself is a real threat. There doesn't seem to be any conclusive reports, but it's a toxic contaminant, and if you know that your baby is drinking your milk and there's toxic contaminants in your milk, then, you know, it becomes a very serious concern to all of us.
Public health scientists in Quebec have been monitoring long-range pollutants in Inuit breast milk for 5 years. They've found levels of toxic contamination 5 times higher than in southern Canada. Now they're trying to discover how this is affecting the health of Arctic mothers and babies.
All these compounds first are carcinogenic, and this is the reason why they are banned also. Also because they are long persistent in the environment, but also because they are carcinogenic. This is the first effect. And after is chronic effects like skin disease, also hepatic injury, and also immunotoxic effects. And actually for us, this is the main problem we are looking for. Is there some link between PCB and DDT exposure of babies and immune dysfunction? And after, between immune dysfunction and infectious disease. Because infectious disease in the north is the main problem of baby.
In Arctic maternity wards, scientists are trying to find out whether contaminated breast milk is damaging the immune systems of newborn babies, making them vulnerable to infectious disease.
What we know already is that the infection rates of babies in northern Quebec is high. The rate is around 30 per 1,000, which is 4 to 5 times higher than the rest of the province. And one of the hypotheses is that PCB may affect the immune system of the baby, which is fragile. And PCB may also affect the hepatic, so it's the liver activity of the baby. We observed the high rates of otitis, high rates of meningitis, high rates of bronchiolitis and bronchitis, and pneumonia also. Meningitis, we observed that is could be sometimes the incidence is 200 times higher than in the United States. So it's very, very high.
These Inuit children cannot control the poisons coming into their environment. Only the governments of polluting nations can make a difference. Canada has put $100 million into an Arctic environment strategy, and Minister Jean Charest believes research must be the priority spending.
We have learned, for example, that you will only get other countries to act if you can base it on information that objectively is proven, is scientifically proven. But politically, it'll be extremely difficult to get any country to act if you cannot clearly, scientifically establish a link between something that's happening in our environment and something that they themselves will do. The reverse side of the coin is that you have to know that there's no country in the world that's going to volunteer information to the effect that they're polluting another country, especially if it's a country that is not rich or has its own economic difficulties. Nobody's going to rise their hand and say, oh, you know, that DDT that's in your environment, we're actually sending it over and we're very sorry about it. How much do we owe you? It doesn't work that way. So, and it's a long-term process, one that we have to start now if we're going to get some action on these problems.
Along the course of the famous Yukon River lies another of Canada's Arctic problems, this time of its own making. This grey sludge stretches for miles. Mining waste has turned this once fertile valley into a lifeless, silted desert. Decades of unfettered mineral extraction around the polar region have taken their toll, and today the north is strewn with hazardous waste from hundreds of abandoned mines and military bases. Before 1972, there were no regulations governing land use in the Arctic. For 100 years after the gold rush, the land was stripped bare, exploited and abandoned, leaving a legacy of deserted machinery and dangerous chemicals. Even where the rivers do still flow, their waters hide a less visible pollution. Years of ignorance and abuse have filled rivers like the Yukon with everything from untreated sewage to unwanted military vehicles. The Canadian government is now monitoring water quality to assess the extent of this pollution. Analysis of fish taken from the river is already revealing alarming results.
We first did sampling in Lake Lebarge, downstream of the city of Whitehorse, in 1989. Our purpose for the work was to look at what the effects of the city of Whitehorse might have been, long-term effects on the ecosystem. We were concerned particularly at that time about sewage output. We decided as part of that program to include samples of fish, of representative species, tissue analyses for metals, and we decided to include in that organochlorine, pesticides, and PCBs. We really didn't expect to find anything other than establish a baseline long-range air transport level from that work. When we got the results back, we were extremely surprised to find quite relatively high levels of DDT, another pesticide called toxaphene, and PCBs.
These poisons could have come to the Arctic from thousands of miles away, carried in air currents and the weather, but the levels are much too high. The scientists decided there must be a local source. For example, the pesticide DDT was used heavily here for mosquito control in the 1950s. This is the most obvious culprit. Rusting fuel and chemical drums carelessly dumped for decades into rivers and lakes. The Canadian government has identified 800 sites like this, for which they plan an expensive Arctic cleanup. They may take away the eyesore, but many of the drums will be empty. Their contents leaked long ago to an ever more poisoned pole. Amid these images of pristine beauty is the unmistakable stamp of the 20th century. From Siberia to Alaska, the Arctic is now scarred by some of the world's largest industrial complexes. Multinationals have been extracting oil from polar sites since the 60s. These wells are at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's north coast. From here, 2.5 million barrels of oil a day are pumped to America's fuel-hungry public. These sites are home to thousands of workers and billions of tons of heavy industry. Environmentalists say it's like putting Chicago in the middle of one of the most delicate ecosystems in the world.
Well, I think the record is a troubling one. It shows that even though the oil companies have made, as they claim, some major efforts to have cleaner operations up there, what it really shows is that whenever you put a major industrial operation in the middle of a pristine environment with the kind of fragility that the Arctic environment has, you're going to get repercussions. There have been a history of hazardous waste spills. There has been mishandling of hazardous waste. There have been spills to the tundra. There have been pipeline spills. There's clear record that there's inordinate amounts of wildlife damage along the pipeline and at Prudhoe Bay. And Prudhoe Bay, as an industrial facility, has air toxic emissions that are like any other industrial facilities. In fact, that they approach the air toxic emissions in certain categories of the city of Chicago. That may be acceptable in some areas, but in the Arctic, in what is a pristine environment that's, in a sense, an ecologically fragile environment, that's not acceptable.
The oil companies, however, claim that the Arctic is safe in their hands.
It is an industrial site, and through construction of pads and roads and everything that naturally goes with development, yes, we've covered up some land. But we're looking forward to developing techniques where we can go back and restore it to a natural site. And really the goal of the company when we leave is to leave it a natural and useful environment.
Cleaning up Prudhoe Bay when the oil runs out will not be easy. Drills like this do not just extract oil. They also produce a vast quantity of hazardous liquid waste. Tens of millions of gallons have been injected into the Arctic tundra. To the oil workers, it's not a problem.
I've been up here for 8 years here in Prudhoe Bay area, and seen a lot of wildlife. I spent 3 years when they built the pipeline, working on the pipeline. One seems to be coexisting along with the other one quite well.
The Arctic fox may seem happy scavenging under oil pipes, but wildlife here is constantly threatened by poisons buried in dozens of dump sites.
The Environmental Department handles all hazardous waste on the North Slope. Our emphasis is on the minimization of waste, and we are aggressively trying to come up with techniques for neutralization, filtration, and extraction of precious metals, etc., in order to reduce the amount of waste. Any waste that cannot be processed up here, we go ahead and ship outside to authorized disposal facilities. There is no effect to the environment.
Other oil companies are not so careful. Dumps like these contain toxic waste, such as battery acid and chloroform. Government inspection records show how oil companies have continually violated disposal regulations, polluting land and water. Another concern is the pipeline, which carries 60,000 gallons of oil per minute across the Alaskan wilderness.
The Trans-Alaska Pipeline begins here at Pump Station 1 and travels 800 miles through Alaska to our marine terminal in Valdez. There are a large number of valves on the pipeline. 160 of those valves are remotely controlled from our Operations Control Center in Valdez. In the event of any kind of a rupture in the pipeline, controllers at Valdez could shut down the pipeline in 6 minutes. Originally, I believe the pipeline was supposed to have a 50-year life, and corrosion was anticipated, but we did have more problems with corrosion than we did anticipate. But with improving technology, we can determine more exactly where the corrosion is, and we've committed the resources to repair the pipeline wherever we need to.
Most Alaskans believed the oil company promises until the Exxon Valdez hit the rocks. That was 11 million gallons of North Slope crude oil spilled into the Gulf of Alaska, hundreds of thousands of birds, thousands of sea otters killed. We're afraid of the same kind of thing happening in the Arctic.
The fears of environmental pressure groups have increased as the oil companies lobby to expand their activities into more Arctic territory. The reserves at Prudhoe Bay are already beginning to run out. The industry believes new oil fields lie beneath the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge, known simply as ANWR, is protected by US law from any mineral exploitation. The oil companies argue national energy security should come before Arctic conservation.
The coastal plain of ANWR is perceived by everybody to have the best prospects for large quantities of new oil. And so it's the obvious place to look if you want to better the present adverse energy situation in the United States.
The oil industry has considerable power in Congress, and may well win the battle to expand into ANWR. But they are not the only ones with a vested interest in the reserve. Elsewhere in ANWR, the Gwich'in Indians have survived for centuries, hunting with their husky teams and living off another rich resource, not oil, but caribou. Now they've turned their survival skills to politics and are lobbying Congress for assurance that the caribou breeding grounds will never be disturbed by oil exploration. Each year they harvest a controlled number of animals using knowledge and skills handed down through generations. The Gwich'in argue that the caribou are the cornerstone of their culture as well as their staple diet.
We totally subsistent off that herd. We use the skin, we use the bone and meat, every part of it. And that's maybe 75% of our daily diet is caribou. We identify ourselves with that herd. And, you know, we do caribou dance and we sing caribou song and we tell caribou stories, and it's identify with our tribe, our Gwich'in people. And it's really our identity because we totally depend on that herd, and it was because of that herd our tribe survived. And that's why we're here today.
The caribou breeding grounds are on the coastal plain, exactly where the prospectors want to drill. Even the US government admits development would mean a drastic decrease in the caribou population. 86-year-old Ginny Sam and other Gwich'in elders believe such disruption of the herd would mean the end of their tribe. The issue arouses many passions. For every native Indian defending their existence, there are scores of oil workers defending theirs.
We're not allowed to go into ANWR and look for oil. The oil company workers, including myself, would lose my job. The gas prices are going to go up, and basically the American economy is going to go down. I think the environmentalists need to look at what we've done here in Prudhoe and let us go ahead and try and find something in ANWR. I personally don't have much time for the environmentalists.
We think it's a mistake to sacrifice one of the greatest world treasures, really ecological treasures, one of the last great intact Arctic ecosystems, for what amounts to 200 days of oil for the American economy. The amount of oil that the administration has speculated may be in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is about 3 billion barrels. Now, we could get that same 3 billion barrels by just raising the auto efficiency of American cars, on average 3 to 5 miles per gallon.
Basically, to go into the coastal plain believing that there was any chance of harming those caribou would be so damaging to your corporation as to put its future in jeopardy. I mean, you have to be confident that you can work rationally in that area without damaging the wildlife. Otherwise, British Petroleum would probably be pushed out of the North American commercial arena for the damage it gave rise to.
The Arctic Refuge is the Serengeti of the North. We have hundreds of thousands of caribou roaming the plains. We lost that in the rest of America. We've lost our buffalo. They were massacred in the last century. This is all that's left. It's the last pristine ecosystem that we have. It's untouched by man. Now, the oil companies have more than 1,000 miles of Arctic coastline on which to drill for oil. We're asking for 125 miles to be left alone.
Thousands of miles from the Alaskan oil and the Gwich'in Indians is Stavanger in Norway. Here, scientists from the US space agency NASA are discovering an invisible threat to the Arctic. Their findings have serious implications for us all. A converted U-2 spy plane, NASA's most advanced research aircraft, is returning to its Norwegian base from a flight 18 kilometers above the North Pole. These flights have brought back evidence of one of the most disturbing discoveries about the northern environment, the loss of the Earth's protective ozone shield.
The two areas that are very significant at this moment are the Antarctic and the Arctic polar regions. In the Antarctic, we've absolutely demonstrated that chlorine, man-made gases, are destroying ozone at a very significant rate. Ozone depletion clearly is not in the best interest of human society. Ozone protects us against the harmful ultraviolet rays from the sun. Less ozone would lead to more cases of skin cancer in white population, adverse effects on plants and aquatic organisms. And one of the key issues at the moment is, why has the ozone in the North Polar regions, especially in winter, decreased?
Packed full of scientific experiments, the converted spy plane is designed to answer this question.
NASA 706, your clearance is via the flight plan route. Climb to flight level 650. After takeoff, left turn direct, Victor India Golf. Squawk 4206, when airborne, go radar 119.6. Correct.
The experiments in Norway have been unbelievably successful, so we're extremely happy with getting a large number of flights off, all instruments working with a massive amount of data that will clearly help us to understand what the chemical and physical processes are that are controlling that ozone in the atmosphere around us.
This DC-8 is another member of NASA's Scientific Air Force. Once an airliner, now a high-altitude laboratory, its passengers are ozone researchers, working 40,000 feet above the Arctic Ocean.
We have a number of experiments on this plane. Some of them are remote sensing, some of them are in situ. In situ meaning that as we fly, they sample the atmosphere at that level that you're flying. And that can be anywhere from about 35,000 feet to 41,000 feet. We also have some instruments on board, some LiDARs, which are capable of remote sensing, which look upward and can sense up to about 24 kilometers and sense the aerosol content and ozone contents that exists above the aircraft up to those levels.
This research has revealed that the ozone layer is thinning 5 times faster than predicted. The blue area on these satellite images shows daily loss over the northern hemisphere. The greatest loss is where the squares are darkest. Here, the ozone hole is over northern Europe. These countries are losing their ozone shield, putting people like the citizens of Stavanger at greater risk from UV radiation. NASA predicts an extra 11 million cases of skin cancer over the next 50 years, meaning Arctic ozone depletion will kill nearly 250,000 of us by 2040. This is despite the banning of CFCs in aerosols by many developed countries.
Well, it's like here in Norway, we're not allowed to sell this gas that we used to do. It was a few years ago, I can remember, when they changed the spray on the hairsprays and the perfumes and everything.
But if other countries are to be persuaded to follow the Norwegian example, more scientific evidence will be needed to force hard political decisions. In Canada, researchers are now discovering man-made pollution at heights of over 30 kilometers, well beyond the altitude range of the ER2. Helium-filled balloons are launched daily from weather stations around the Arctic. Remote sensing experiments are fixed beneath the balloon. They'll send back a constant stream of data on the shifting levels of ozone and the chemicals which are destroying it. These experiments are shedding light on why the Arctic is the site of so much ozone destruction. It's been found that the extreme cold of the Arctic stratosphere accelerates the conversion of ozone into oxygen, removing from the planet its delicate ozone shell.
The computer will do a final analysis of this chart and give us a printout of all these accurate readings. This is the ozone zero, this straight line, reasonably straight line. So this being zero and this being an increase in the ozone through the atmosphere and along here, and starting to decrease up here. So I'm going to draw this together along here.
Meanwhile, across the Arctic, the search for more data and greater understanding continues. The scientific survey base at Resolute Bay is just a few miles from the magnetic North Pole. It's not just the thinning of the ozone above them that worries scientists here. Beneath them, the ice sheet is thinning as well. Steered by one wheel and one ski, this strange vehicle dates from the 1950s, but it's still the ideal transport for researchers keeping track of a melting Arctic ice sheet. Braving temperatures below -60, researchers from Resolute regularly travel out across the frozen Arctic Ocean to measure the thickness of the winter ice. The local population watches on calmly. There's still enough ice to support the weight of this bearded seal, but delicate changes in climate will affect the food chain on which it survives.
That's it.
Weekly measurements like this are already showing a gradual melting of the Arctic ice cap as a result of global warming.
Why not just do it right here? 52 centimeters of ice and about 38 centimeters of snow. The more there's snow, the rest there's ice.
The Arctic is it's a huge area. I don't think people appreciate just how big it is. And in terms of global issues, like the global warming issue, we expect to see the results of that in higher latitudes. In other words, we'll see a more rapid rate of increase in warming in the Arctic. Well, of course, the obvious thing that's going to happen with that is the melting of the polar ice caps and the raising of sea levels. So that someone living in London may very shortly find themselves underwater if they're not concerned about global warming because of the melting of the Arctic ice cap. So that things that happen elsewhere in the world that are affecting the Arctic are undoubtedly going to come back to affect people in southern latitudes. So we can't just think of it as up there somewhere and we don't need to worry about it.
For the past 3 years, Garth Bangay has been the principal architect of an 8-nation plan to protect the planet's northern wilderness. An Arctic Environment Protection Strategy has now been agreed by all the circumpolar countries. Its first task, to increase and coordinate research around the Arctic and find out exactly how bad things are and what needs to be done.
We finally have 8 countries that share the management, if you like, of that circumpolar world, all talking together. And it is rather historic just to have the 8 together. And it's been a very constructive dialogue. People are beginning to sense that they share similar problems. And we're also doing it with the native people. We've begun at our second meeting to involve the native people who live in that region directly in the discussion, and I think that's really constructive.
It is early days, and the International Arctic Environment Strategy is still only a scientific research program. But there is new hope amongst many environmental organizations that maybe, at last, something can be done for a region which has long been abused and long been ignored.
It's a magnificent part of the world with a people and a form of wildlife which have adapted beautifully. They're just very comfortable in that setting. Thank you very much. So it deserves to be conserved and protected and respected in its own right and for its own sake. It also has got a critical role in the climate of the Earth, and you know, we have very selfish reasons for wanting to conserve the Arctic. I do not think things have gone so far in the Arctic that it's a lost cause by a long shot. I think there is still tremendous conservation opportunities in the Arctic. So I'm not a pessimist. I don't think things have gone too far, and I think this is an area where conservation can really make a difference.